In the quiet hours of evening, when the noise of the modern world fades away and the hum of cars on highways becomes little more than a distant murmur, one can imagine stepping back through time. The United States, as we know it today, is built on centuries of layers, moments of triumph, mistakes, conflicts, and unexpected discoveries that slowly shaped its course. What follows is not a tale of loud drama, nor of hurried action, but a patient unfolding of history, told in a way that lingers, like an old voice carried through the corridors of time, measured, calm, and deliberate. The earliest story of America does not begin with great cities or mighty armies. It begins with landscapes, endless forests, wide rivers, mountains rising like the spines of ancient creatures, and prairies stretching far beyond the horizon. Long before Europeans ever looked westward across the Atlantic, this land was alive with civilizations, thousands of years before the founding fathers ever spoke of liberty. The first peoples had already carved their lives into the soil. Communities rose along river valleys, where fish swam in abundance, where fertile ground could be tilled for maize and beans, and where trade routes stretched far across the continent. Consider the great mound builders of the Mississippi Valley. Around the city we now call St. Louis, long before any European settlement, stood Cahokia, a city of tens of thousands of people at its height. From around 1050 to 1350, it flourished as a cultural and political center, with vast earthen mounds rising above the plains. The largest, known as Monk's Mound, still stands today, its presence a reminder of an organized, sophisticated society that built without stone, without steel, but with will and vision. Imagine the slow, steady labor of thousands of hands, carrying basket after basket of earth to build a monument to their community, to their gods, or to their rulers. From these heights, leaders could look out across a city of wooden palisades, houses, plazas, and temples. And though little is left of that city now beyond mounds and fragments, it was once as alive and full of purpose as any capital we know. North of there, in the woodlands, tribes like the Iroquois built longhouses where families lived under one roof, their lives woven tightly with kinship and tradition. To the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans raised their dwellings in the cliffs of what is now Colorado and New Mexico. Their homes were carved into stone itself, rooms stacked one upon another, accessible by ladders that could be pulled up for safety. Each of these communities carried with it stories of creation, rituals tied to the earth, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. But the world was never still. Climate shifts, droughts, and changes in resources forced some of these cultures to move, to adapt, or to vanish entirely. By the time Europeans first reached the shores of the Americas, native nations had already experienced centuries of growth, conflict, and migration. They were not untouched lands waiting to be claimed. They were already landscapes filled with meaning, with history, with people who belonged deeply to them. And then, across the ocean, winds carried ships westward. In 1492, when Columbus first set foot in the Caribbean islands, the world that native peoples had known began to shift in ways no one could have fully foreseen. To the Europeans, these lands seemed new, but to those already living there, they were home. Columbus's arrival was only the beginning of waves of contact. Spanish explorers, Portuguese traders, French fur trappers, English settlers, each bringing not only their hopes, but also diseases, weapons, and ambitions that would alter lives on an unimaginable scale. At first, contact was tentative. The Spanish built missions in Florida and the Southwest. The French moved through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi, trading beaver pelts and forging alliances with tribes. The English, for their part, began small, first with Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, a settlement that nearly failed under hunger, disease, and tension with the Powhatan Confederacy. The early years were fragile, and for many who made the journey, The New World was not a place of quick fortune, but of struggle and survival. Imagine the weary faces of settlers, ill-prepared for winters, facing shortages of food, relying desperately on aid from native neighbors, only to later clash with them in cycles of mistrust and violence. Slowly, colonies grew. From Massachusetts to Georgia, settlements stretched along the Atlantic coast, each with its own reasons for being. Some were havens for religious groups fleeing persecution, Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania. Others were economic ventures, plantations built on tobacco, rice, and later cotton, industries that would draw enslaved Africans across the ocean in chains. The story of America was never one of easy harmony. It was one of ambition and consequence, of dreams shadowed by exploitation. By the 1700s, 13 colonies had taken root, and each carried both European traditions and uniquely American adaptations. The forests became timber for ships, the fields produced crops for markets abroad, and the rivers carried trade deep into the interior. Yet in the background, tensions simmered. Conflicts with native tribes who resisted the loss of their homelands, rivalries between European empires competing for dominance, and the growing realization among colonists that their ties to Britain were not unbreakable. The French and Indian War, beginning in 1754, marked one of these turning points. It was not merely a colonial struggle, but a global war, with Britain and France fighting on several continents. On American soil, it meant shifting alliances between tribes and empires, battles fought in forests and along rivers, and eventually, Britain's dominance over French territories. Yet, victory came with a price. Debts that led Britain to tax its colonies more heavily, planting seeds of discontent. The slow drift toward independence was not yet clear, but the ground was being prepared. Colonists who once thought of themselves proudly as British subjects began to see themselves as something else. The soil of America, rich, demanding, and filled with contradiction, was shaping a new identity. History, when told slowly, shows us how gradual these shifts are. No revolution comes in a single night. No nation is born in a moment. It is in the quiet accumulation of grievances, the slow growth of communities, the steady pressure of circumstances that great changes begin. And so, as the 18th century drew near its middle, the land that had once been only forests and rivers, then a patchwork of native nations, then a scattering of fragile colonies, was now something more, a stage set for conflict, for transformation, for the long, restless birth of what would become the United States. This was the beginning, not of a single story, but of many woven together threads of triumph and sorrow, of cultures colliding, blending, or breaking apart. And if we linger here, in the early chapters, we can almost hear the faint echoes of voices, the chants of a Cahokian ceremony, the creak of wooden ships against Atlantic waves, the solemn prayers of Puritans in New England, the shouts of warriors defending their homeland. All of these sounds belong to the first scene of America's long, unhurried history. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies along the Atlantic coast were no longer fragile outposts. They had grown into bustling settlements with towns, farms, ports, and trade networks. Ships sailed daily between colonial harbors and England, carrying tobacco, rice, indigo, timber, and furs across the ocean, while manufactured goods returned in exchange. Streets of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston buzzed with merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and farmers selling their produce. Life in these colonies was no longer experimental. It was established, deeply rooted in the soil of America. Yet beneath the surface of this growing prosperity, a slow unease began to build. The French and Indian War, which had ended in 1763, had shifted the balance of power in North America. Britain emerged victorious, claiming control over vast new territories once held by France. For the colonists, the victory seemed at first like a triumph. They could now imagine expanding westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains into lands rich with soil and opportunity. But for the British Crown, the war had been costly. The debts piled high in London, and Parliament began searching for ways to ease the financial burden. The colonies, in the eyes of British leaders, should pay their fair share. After all, the war had been fought in part to protect them. So began the first stirrings of tension. In 1763, the Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To many colonists, this felt like a betrayal. They had fought alongside British troops with the expectation that the frontier would open to them. Instead, they were told to stay east, while the land was reserved for native tribes under British supervision. For frontiersmen, surveyors, and families eager to claim new land, it was a bitter disappointment. Next came the taxes. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, raising duties on sugar, molasses, and other goods imported into the colonies. For merchants, it cut into profits. For ordinary people, it was a reminder that decisions were being made far across the ocean by men they had never seen. Then in 1765, the Stamp Act struck even deeper. For the first time, colonists were required to pay a direct tax on paper goods. Legal documents, newspapers, playing cards. Suddenly, everyday life carried the mark of British taxation. The response was swift. Across the colonies, resistance took root. Newspapers carried fiery essays arguing that taxation without representation was tyranny. Pamphlets circulated in taverns, where men gathered over mugs of ale to debate the rights of Englishmen. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York in 1765, with delegates from 9 colonies declaring that Parliament had no right to tax them without their consent. Protests filled the streets. Effigies of tax collectors were burned, and in some towns, mobs gathered outside officials' homes, shouting their defiance. The colonies, though still loyal to the king, were beginning to discover a shared voice. Though Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, the tension did not ease. The following year, the Townshend Acts imposed duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, resistance spread. Colonists organized boycotts, refusing to import British goods. Women, often overlooked in political matters, took leading roles, spinning homespun cloth so that households could avoid buying British textiles, brewing herbal teas to replace imported leaves. Their quiet acts of defiance gave strength to the movement. Boston, in particular, became a hotbed of unrest. British troops were stationed there to enforce order, their red coats a constant reminder of imperial authority. Tensions between soldiers and townspeople simmered, fueled by insults, fights, and resentment. On a cold March night in 1770, this unease boiled over into the Boston Massacre. A crowd gathered, hurling snowballs and taunts at a group of soldiers. Confusion, shouting, a shove, then musket fire. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead on the cobblestones. Paul Revere's engraving and Samuel Adams's fiery speeches spread the story, painting it as a deliberate act of brutality. Across the colonies, the massacre became a symbol of oppression, a warning of what unchecked authority could bring. For a brief moment, the anger cooled. Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, leaving only the tax on tea as a symbol of its power. Yet the colonists had tasted resistance, and they did not forget. By 1773, a new crisis loomed. The Tea Act, intended to rescue the struggling British East India Company, gave it the exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies. To Parliament, it seemed a practical solution. To the colonists, it was another insult, a way to force them to accept taxation without choice. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men in Boston, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in the harbor. Quietly, efficiently, they broke open chests of tea and poured them into the water. The Boston Tea Party, as it became known, was not an act of drunken chaos, but of calculated defiance. The dark waters of the harbor carried the message. The colonies would not be forced into submission. London's response was swift and harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts, in the colonies. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts' self-government was curtailed. British officials accused of crimes could be tried in England rather than in colonial courts. Soldiers could be quartered in colonists' homes. To Britain, these measures were meant to restore control. To the colonists, they were proof that their liberties were under assault. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Men from different regions, New England farmers, Southern planters, merchants from the middle colonies, sat together, debating how to respond. For many, independence was not yet the goal. They still spoke of loyalty to the king, but they also declared their rights as Englishmen and pledged to resist unconstitutional laws. They agreed to form committees of correspondence, to enforce boycotts, and to prepare for the possibility that words alone would not be enough. The stage was set. By early 1775, the tension had grown almost unbearable. British troops remained in Boston, their presence a constant provocation. In villages and towns, local militias began drilling. Ordinary farmers and tradesmen practicing with muskets, calling themselves minute men for their readiness to respond at a moment's notice. The atmosphere was one of uneasy waiting, as though a storm gathered on the horizon. Looking back, it is easy to see where these roads led. But for those who lived it, the outcome was uncertain. Many still hoped for reconciliation, for some compromise that would allow them to remain British subjects while preserving their liberties. Others, more radical, already dreamed of complete independence, of a nation free to chart its own destiny. The colonies were no longer simply extensions of Britain. They were becoming something else, something new. The calm rhythm of colonial life, planting crops, trading goods, attending church, raising families, now carried an undercurrent of expectation. Every act of Parliament, every ship that entered a harbor, every speech in a tavern seemed to push the colonies closer to a breaking point. And in the quiet fields of New England, where men stacked muskets in barns and women stored powder in secret places, history itself seemed to hold its breath. Soon, the spark would be lit. The spring of 1775 arrived with an uneasy tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the American colonies. In Boston, the presence of British soldiers remained a heavy weight on the minds of its people. Red-coated regiments drilled in the streets, their boots striking cobblestones with mechanical precision, while ships of the Royal Navy anchored in the harbor, their cannons silently aimed toward the town. To the British, these forces were there to keep order, to ensure loyalty. To the colonists, they were symbols of domination, constant reminders that their freedoms could be stripped away at the point of a musket. Rumors spread faster than news could be printed. It was whispered in taverns, murmured in markets, and carried by riders along the dusty post roads. The British planned to move against the colonial militias. Weapons and powder, secretly gathered by local communities, were being targeted. The British command sought to disarm the rebels before rebellion could truly ignite. For months, General Thomas Gage, the commander of British forces in Boston, had tried to maintain control without provoking outright war. But his orders from London were clear. The colonies must be subdued and their defiance brought to heel. The colonists, however, were not idle. In Massachusetts, militias trained in secret, drilling with muskets, and preparing themselves for what many feared was inevitable. These men were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants. Yet they carried within them a fierce determination, an understanding that the struggle was no longer simply about taxes or trade, but about the very right to govern themselves. They called themselves minute men, promising to be ready at a moment's notice. Behind every barn door, in every village green, the colonies quietly prepared for war. The spark came in April. On the night of April 18, 1775, British troops marched out of Boston with a mission to seize colonial weapons stored in the town of Concord. Nearly 800 soldiers, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and supported by Major John Pitcairn, moved silently through the countryside under cover of darkness. Their orders were simple: confiscate supplies, arrest suspected leaders, and show the colonists that rebellion would not be tolerated. But the countryside was alive with watchful eyes. Riders had already been sent out, spreading the alarm. The most famous among them was Paul Revere, who mounted his horse and rode through the night, shouting warnings. "The regulars are coming out!" Villages awoke to the sound of hooves pounding the earth. Church bells rang, drums beat, and lanterns flickered in windows as men grabbed muskets and hurried into the night. The message spread like fire. The British were on the move. As dawn approached, the British column reached the small town of Lexington. On the village green, about 70 colonial militia stood waiting, led by Captain John Parker. Their numbers were small compared to the approaching redcoats, but they stood their ground, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Parker, aware of the danger, is said to have told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The tension was unbearable. The British advanced, ordering the militia to disperse. Then, in the pale light of morning, a shot rang out. No one could later say who fired it, whether a nervous militiaman, a British soldier, or a shot from the shadows. But that single musket blast shattered the silence of centuries. Chaos erupted. British troops fired into the militia, and when the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, their blood soaking into the soil of Lexington. The Revolutionary War had begun. The British continued on to Concord, only to find that most of the colonial supplies had already been hidden away. At the North Bridge, however, hundreds of militia had gathered, their numbers swelling as men from nearby towns arrived. When the British attempted to cross, shots were exchanged. This time the colonists stood firm. Muskets cracked, smoke filled the air, and red-coated soldiers fell back in confusion. The tide had shifted. The once untrained farmers had stood their ground against the might of the King's army. What followed was a retreat that turned into a nightmare for the British. As they marched back toward Boston, colonial militias swarmed from every direction. From behind stone walls, from the cover of trees, from barns and fences, the colonists fired relentlessly. Mile after mile, the road became a gauntlet. By the time the weary British troops staggered into the safety of Boston, they had suffered heavy casualties. The colonies had not only resisted, they had drawn blood. News of Lexington and Concord spread rapidly, carried by riders and newspapers. Across the colonies, the story was told and retold. Ordinary men had faced the greatest empire on earth and lived to tell of it. For some, it was proof that reconciliation was no longer possible. For others, it was a moment of dread, a realization that the path ahead would be bloody and uncertain. But no one could deny that a line had been crossed. There was no turning back. In the weeks that followed, militias from across New England poured into the area around Boston, forming a makeshift army that surrounded the city. British troops were now effectively trapped inside, cut off from the countryside. Tension mounted as both sides prepared for what would come next. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775. Delegates from all 13 colonies gathered once more, their debates filled with urgency. Some, like John Adams of Massachusetts, pressed for immediate action, arguing that the colonies must organize a continental army. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still hoped for reconciliation, believing that a final appeal to the king might prevent full-scale war. The chamber was filled with uncertainty. Yet there was a growing realization that the colonies must stand together. From this Congress came a momentous decision: the appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington, tall and dignified, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was seen as a unifying figure. His presence gave the colonies not just a leader, but a symbol of shared resolve. As summer approached, the first major battle erupted. On June 17, 1775, colonial forces fortified positions on the hills overlooking Boston. When British troops advanced to dislodge them, the result was the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonists, though eventually forced to retreat, inflicted heavy casualties on the British. The message was clear: this would not be an easy conflict. Still, even amid the fighting, hope for peace lingered. In July, the Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, affirming loyalty to the crown and asking for reconciliation. But the king, enraged by the growing rebellion, refused to receive it. Instead, he declared the colonies in open revolt. The divide was complete. Through the long months of 1775, the colonies transformed. Town meetings, once places for discussing local concerns, now became centers of revolutionary fervor. Pamphlets circulated widely, urging independence, liberty, and resistance. Farmers left their fields to join militias. Blacksmiths forged weapons. Women managed farms and businesses in the absence of their husbands. The war effort seeped into every corner of colonial life. Yet uncertainty remained. No one knew how long the struggle would last, nor what sacrifices it would demand. The British Empire was vast, its army and navy unmatched. The colonies were fragmented, their soldiers poorly equipped, their leaders divided. And yet, in the stillness of those early days of war, a sense of destiny began to grow. For generations, the colonies had been bound by loyalty to a distant king. Now, through bloodshed and defiance, they were beginning to see themselves as something new. A people united not by geography alone, but by shared ideals, by a belief that they had the right to govern themselves. The battles of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill were only the beginning. Ahead lay years of hardship, of victories and defeats, of triumphs and despair. But the course was set. The revolution had begun, and with it, the long and uncertain journey toward independence. The year 1776 dawned with both promise and peril. Snow lay heavy across the countryside, blanketing towns and farms in silence. But beneath that stillness, the colonies pulsed with restlessness. The events of the previous year, Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, the siege of Boston, had shaken the foundation of colonial life. No longer was the conflict a distant possibility. It had arrived with smoke, blood, and the thunder of muskets. The question that now lingered in every mind was whether reconciliation with Britain remained possible, or whether a final, irrevocable break must be made. By early winter, Boston itself had become the focal point of war. General George Washington, newly appointed commander-in-chief, took command of the ragtag Continental Army that had gathered outside the city. It was an army in name more than in reality. Farmers with hunting rifles, men in mismatched clothing, many lacking powder and shot, few with training. Washington, tall, reserved, and commanding, brought order and discipline. He drilled the men, organized supplies, and turned an enthusiastic but chaotic force into something resembling an army. Inside Boston, British General William Howe struggled as well. His soldiers were well trained, but the siege cut off supplies, and the presence of thousands of restless colonists outside the city created constant pressure. Washington seized the high ground in March of 1776, fortifying Dorchester Heights with cannons that had been dragged through snow and wilderness from Fort Ticonderoga. From those hills, his guns commanded the harbor. The British, recognizing the danger, chose to withdraw. On March 17th, Their troops and Loyalist supporters boarded ships and sailed for Halifax, leaving Boston in colonial hands. The first great victory of the Revolution had come, not by direct battle, but by persistence and strategy. Yet victory in Boston did not mean safety. Britain was far from finished. Across the Atlantic, King George III and Parliament were determined to crush the rebellion. Ships and regiments were already being prepared to sail, an overwhelming force that would soon descend on New York. Washington and his army knew that the struggle was only beginning. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress continued its debates. The delegates represented a spectrum of opinion. Some still clung to the hope of peace, fearful of the consequences of outright independence. Others, increasingly convinced that reconciliation was impossible, pressed for bold action. The Olive Branch Petition had been rejected, and the King's declaration that the colonies were in open rebellion left little room for compromise. The air grew heavy with arguments, speeches, and pamphlets, each pulling the colonies closer to a decision that would change history. Into this atmosphere came a pamphlet that electrified the colonies. Published in January 1776, it bore the simple title Common Sense and was written by an English-born thinker named Thomas Paine. His words, plain and direct, cut through hesitation. He argued that it was absurd for a continent to be governed by an island, that monarchy was a system rooted in tyranny, and that America's destiny lay in independence. He wrote not for scholars, but for farmers, merchants, and laborers. His phrases carried the rhythm of conviction. Liberty was a natural right, and Britain's rule was nothing but oppression. Within weeks, tens of thousands of copies spread across the colonies. Read aloud in taverns and town squares, Paine's words gave voice to what many already felt, but had not yet dared to say. The tide shifted. Calls for independence grew louder. Local assemblies passed resolutions urging separation. Town meetings and church sermons echoed with the language of freedom. By the spring of 1776, the question was no longer whether the colonies could reconcile with Britain, but whether they dared to declare themselves free. In June, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration. 5 men were chosen: Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. Though each contributed, the task of writing fell largely to Jefferson. In his rented room, he sat at a small desk, pen in hand, crafting words that would resonate across centuries. He drew upon Enlightenment philosophy, upon colonial grievances, upon the deep conviction that liberty was the right of all people. His draft declared that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed, and when that consent was betrayed, the people had the right to alter or abolish their government. Debate followed. Congress revised Jefferson's words, striking passages, softening some phrases, sharpening others. But the heart of the Declaration remained. On July 6, 1776, the Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and the document was read aloud in cities and villages. The words carried across the colonies. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. With those sentences, the colonies ceased to be subjects of Britain and became, in their own eyes, the United States of America. It was a bold proclamation, but also a dangerous one. To Britain, it was treason, punishable by death. Every signer of the Declaration risked his life, his property, and his reputation. Yet they signed, knowing that history would judge them either as heroes of liberty or as traitors. Even as the ink dried, war pressed on. In the summer of 1776, British forces arrived in overwhelming strength. Hundreds of ships filled the waters around New York, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. Never before had such a fleet been assembled for war in the Americas. General Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, commanded this armada. determined to crush the rebellion in a single blow. Washington moved his army to defend New York, but the challenge was immense. His men were outnumbered, inexperienced, and ill-equipped. In August, the British attacked on Long Island. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with colonial troops driven back under heavy fire. Washington's army suffered severe losses and seemed on the verge of destruction. Yet, in the darkness of night, under cover of fog, Washington orchestrated a daring retreat across the East River, saving his army from annihilation. It was not victory, but survival. And survival was enough to fight another day. Through the autumn, Washington's army retreated across New Jersey, pursued by the British. Morale sank. Soldiers deserted. The cause of independence seemed fragile, threatened by defeat. Yet in December, when hope appeared dim, Washington struck back. Crossing the icy Delaware River on Christmas night, he led his men in a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was small in numbers, but vast in spirit. Days later, another triumph at Princeton renewed confidence. The Revolution, though battered, still lived. In homes across the colonies, families listened to news carried by riders and newspapers. They knew the war would be long and uncertain. Farms were left untended, trade disrupted, lives upended. Yet the dream of independence gave strength. The Declaration was no longer just words on parchment. It was a promise, a cause worth sacrifice. As 1776 came to its end, the United States stood at a threshold. It had declared itself free, fought its first great battles, and endured its first bitter defeats. Ahead lay years of hardship, alliances to be forged, and struggles that would test the limits of endurance. But the course was set, and the world could no longer ignore the voice of a new nation rising on the shores of America. The war for independence had now entered a phase where survival itself was a victory. By the late 1776 and into 1777, the Continental Army, led by General George Washington, had been battered, scattered, and often on the verge of disintegration. Supplies were desperately short, soldiers were hungry and poorly clothed, and the spirit of revolution that had burned brightly at the signing of the Declaration seemed to flicker in the winds of defeat. Yet, it was in this bleak moment that the character of the young United States began to solidify, tested not in triumph, but in the long endurance of struggle. Washington's army had suffered heavy blows in New York. The Battle of Long Island, followed by a desperate retreat across New Jersey, left the American forces diminished and demoralized. Many feared that the dream of independence would collapse before it truly began. British General Howe and his well-trained army had pushed hard, establishing strongholds across the region. Loyalists, those colonists who sided with Britain, were emboldened, and whispers spread that the rebellion was already dying. Washington himself admitted in private correspondence that unless something changed, the cause might soon be lost. Yet, in public, he maintained an unshakable front, knowing that his soldiers, ragged and weary, drew their courage from his resolve. Then came the bitter winter of 1776. On the far side of the Delaware River, British troops and their Hessian allies established winter quarters, confident that the rebellion would wither away with the cold. Washington, however, saw opportunity in their complacency. On the night of December 25, 1776, in one of the boldest maneuvers of the war, he led his army across the icy Delaware River. Battling snow, sleet, and darkness, the Continental soldiers marched through the night. By morning, they struck Trenton, surprising the Hessian garrison. The victory was small in scale, but massive in spirit. The capture of Trenton, followed soon after by another win at Princeton, proved that the Continental Army was not yet defeated. These triumphs rekindled hope in the colonies, drawing new recruits and breathing life into a cause that had seemed nearly extinguished. As the war stretched on into 1777, the British strategy shifted. Their leaders believed that if they could isolate New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the middle and southern colonies, the revolution might collapse. This led to a plan to seize control of the Hudson River Valley. General Burgoyne marched south from Canada with a large British force, intending to meet other British armies moving north from New York City. But the vast American landscape and its determined defenders proved more resilient than expected. At Saratoga, in October 1777, American forces under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold surrounded and forced Burgoyne's army to surrender. The victory at Saratoga was not merely a battlefield triumph. It was a turning point in the entire war. For the first time, the Americans had captured a full British army, and the world took notice. The Saratoga victory had ripples far beyond the battlefields of New York. Across the Atlantic, in France, leaders had been watching the rebellion with interest, but hesitation. France, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War against Britain, saw an opportunity for revenge. Yet, they were reluctant to commit to the American cause without proof that the colonists could stand against the might of Britain. Saratoga provided that proof. In 1778, France formally allied with the United States, sending supplies, funds, and eventually troops and ships to the fight. Spain and the Dutch Republic, too, would later enter the conflict, transforming what had been a colonial rebellion into a global war. Britain suddenly faced not only rebellious subjects across the Atlantic, but also powerful European rivals determined to weaken its empire. While international alliances offered hope, conditions for Washington's army remained desperate. The winter of 1777-1778 at Valley Forge became a symbol of suffering and perseverance. In the Pennsylvania countryside, the Continental Army endured months of bitter cold, hunger, and disease. Soldiers lacked shoes, their feet wrapped in rags, leaving bloody trails in the snow. Huts offered little warmth, and sickness spread quickly in the cramped quarters. Morale faltered, and desertion was common. Yet, out of this suffering emerged a new strength. At Valley Forge, under the training of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer who volunteered his services, the ragged Continental soldiers were drilled into a more disciplined, effective fighting force. Von Steuben introduced a system of training that instilled order, precision, and unity. When spring came, the army that emerged from Valley Forge was no longer a loose collection of militias, but a more cohesive, battle-ready force. Beyond the battlefields, the revolution was reshaping colonial society. Families were divided, with fathers against sons, brothers against brothers. Loyalists faced suspicion, exile, or even violence. Enslaved Africans saw in the war both peril and possibility. Some were promised freedom for fighting with the British, while others were moved by revolutionary rhetoric to hope for liberty in a new nation. Native American tribes, too, were caught in the conflict, some siding with Britain in hopes of halting colonial expansion, others seeking alliances with the rebels. The war was never a neat struggle between two armies. It fractured communities, lives, and long-held relationships. The years that followed saw battles shift from north to south. In the southern colonies, British forces hoped to rally loyalist support and cut into the revolution's strength. Cities like Savannah and Charleston fell, and brutal partisan warfare erupted across the Carolinas. Leaders like Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion used guerrilla tactics to harass British forces, stretching supply lines thin and eroding their control. In these southern campaigns, the war revealed itself as a conflict not only of armies, but of endurance, waged across farms, swamps, and towns. Meanwhile, the alliance with France brought direct military aid. French fleets challenged British control of the seas, and French troops joined the Continental Army. This partnership would prove decisive in the years to come. The war was grinding on, costly for both sides, but the Americans now stood with powerful allies, and the dream of independence no longer seemed impossible. By 1781, the conflict reached a climax. In Virginia, British General Cornwallis fortified his position at Yorktown, believing the Royal Navy would provide support. Instead, French ships under Admiral de Grasse blockaded the coast, while Washington and French General Rochambeau marched their armies south. The siege of Yorktown was relentless, and after weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. The surrender at Yorktown effectively ended major fighting, though smaller skirmishes would continue. Peace negotiations soon followed. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain, exhausted and facing pressures at home and abroad, recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation's boundaries stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida. For the first time, the colonies were not colonies at all, but a free and independent nation. The victory, however, was only the beginning of a new struggle. The war had left behind debts, divisions, and questions. What kind of government would the United States build? How could 13 diverse states, each jealous of its own rights and powers, unite under a single system? And what of the ideals of liberty and equality? How would they be reconciled with the realities of slavery, inequality, and expansion? These questions loomed large as the young nation took its first steps into independence. The revolution had begun with anger over taxes and imperial control, but it ended with something far greater: the birth of a nation that would attempt, in its imperfect and halting way, to embody the principles of self-government and freedom. The American Revolution was both a war of muskets and cannons and a war of ideas. It left scars across the land, divided communities, and reshaped lives. Yet, it also laid the foundation for a new political experiment, one that would influence movements for liberty across the globe. The story of independence was complete, but the story of the United States was only beginning. The revolution closed one chapter and opened another: the long, uncertain journey of building a nation. When the guns of the revolution finally fell silent in 1783, the American colonies stood victorious. But victory was not the same as stability. What emerged from the Treaty of Paris was not a powerful, unified country, but 13 states loosely bound together under the Articles of Confederation. Independence had been won, yet the question of how to govern this new land remained unsettled. The Revolutionary War had ended one struggle, only to begin another: the task of creating a nation. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war, were America's first attempt at a national framework of government. They reflected the colonists' deep suspicion of centralized power, a suspicion rooted in years of conflict with Britain. Under the Articles, the states retained most authority. The National Congress could declare war, make treaties, and manage relations with native tribes, but it could not levy taxes directly, regulate trade, or enforce its laws upon the states. Each state had one vote, regardless of size, and any major decision required the agreement of 9 out of 13 states. Amendments demanded unanimity, an almost impossible standard. This loose arrangement was meant to preserve liberty, but in practice, it left the new nation weak and vulnerable. The immediate aftermath of war revealed the fragility of this system. The country was burdened with debt, millions owed to France, Spain, and private lenders. Without the power to tax, Congress relied on contributions from the states, which were often delayed or never paid. Soldiers returning from war were promised wages and pensions that Congress could not provide. Trade was another source of frustration. With no central authority to regulate commerce, each state pursued its own interests, erecting tariffs and restrictions against neighbors. This disunity bred resentment and inefficiency, threatening the economic survival of the Republic. In the countryside, the economic strain fell hardest on farmers. Taxes imposed by state governments, combined with debt from the war, left many small landowners unable to pay creditors. Courts seized their property, and debtors filled the prisons. Frustration turned to anger, and anger to open rebellion. In Massachusetts, during the winter of 1786-1787, farmers led by Daniel Shays rose against the state government. blocking courts to prevent foreclosures. Shays's rebellion shook the young nation, revealing the weakness of the Confederation. Congress could not muster a national army to put down the uprising. Instead, Massachusetts had to rely on private militias. For many leaders, the rebellion was proof that the Republic teetered on the edge of chaos. Amid these struggles, the western frontier presented both opportunity and challenge. The vast lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River had been ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Paris. Settlers moved westward, seeking farmland and fortune, but their expansion clashed with native nations who resisted encroachment. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 attempted to bring order, establishing a process for creating new states out of Western territories. It also set a precedent. Slavery would be banned in the Northwest Territory. This was an early acknowledgement that the nation would be divided over the institution of slavery, a divide that would grow deeper in the centuries to come. The problems of governance, economics, and expansion convinced many leaders that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate. Figures such as George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton argued that the Republic needed a stronger national government. Their concerns culminated in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, held in Philadelphia. Delegates from 12 states gathered in secrecy, originally intending to revise the Articles, but soon deciding to draft an entirely new framework. The debates in Philadelphia were intense and often contentious. Large states wanted representation based on population, while small states demanded equal voice. The result was the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature with the House of Representatives apportioned by population and the Senate granting equal votes to each state. The issue of slavery loomed large. Southern delegates insisted on protections for their property, while Northern delegates objected. The compromise was uneasy. Enslaved persons would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation, a cruel formula that revealed the contradictions at the heart of the new republic. The Constitution created a system of checks and balances. Executive, legislative and judicial branches designed to restrain one another. It granted Congress the power to tax, regulate commerce, and raise armies. Yet it also preserved significant powers for the states, reflecting the delicate balance between unity and autonomy. When the final draft was signed in September 1787, many delegates saw it as imperfect but necessary. As Benjamin Franklin famously remarked, the Constitution created a republic if you can keep it. Ratification was not assured. Fierce debates erupted between Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who feared it created too strong a central authority. Federalists argued that the new framework was essential to preserve order and liberty. Anti-Federalists demanded explicit protections for individual rights. Their opposition eventually secured the addition of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and due process. In 1789, the Constitution went into effect, and George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. His inauguration in New York City was a solemn moment, marking the transition from revolutionary turmoil to Republican governance. Washington embodied unity and restraint. He set precedents that would shape the presidency itself. He refused the trappings of monarchy, choosing instead to serve with dignity and humility. His cabinet, including Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, reflected the competing visions of the nation's future. Hamilton believed in a strong central government and an economy based on commerce and industry. He proposed the federal assumption of state debts, the creation of a national bank, and policies to encourage manufacturing. Jefferson, in contrast, envisioned a republic of independent farmers, wary of concentrated power and financial elites. This clash of ideas planted the seeds of America's first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. At the same time, foreign affairs tested the fragile nation. The French Revolution erupted in 1789, dividing Americans. Some saw France as a sister republic, fighting for liberty against tyranny. Others feared the radical violence of revolution and preferred neutrality. Washington, cautious and pragmatic, steered a middle course, insisting that the United States remain neutral in European conflicts. This stance preserved peace, but deepened political divisions at home. Domestically, unrest continued. In 1791, Congress imposed a tax on distilled spirits, sparking resistance among farmers in western Pennsylvania. The Whiskey Rebellion tested the federal government's authority. This time, unlike during Shays's Rebellion, the national government acted decisively. Washington personally led troops to suppress the uprising, demonstrating that the Constitution had created a government capable of enforcing its laws. As the 1790s advanced, the challenges of nation-building remained immense. The capital was moved to a new city, Washington, D.C., symbolizing a fresh start. Treaties were signed with native tribes and with Britain, though tensions on the frontier and the seas never fully abated. Yet despite the struggles, the Republic endured. When Washington declined a third term in 1796, he set a precedent of peaceful transfer of power that would become a cornerstone of American democracy. By the time John Adams succeeded Washington as the second president, the United States was still fragile but firmly established. The Revolution had secured independence, and the Constitution had created a framework for governance. Now the task was to live up to the ideals proclaimed in 1776, ideals that remained far from fully realized, but which continued to inspire hope. The early years of the Republic were marked by uncertainty, compromise, and conflict. Yet they also revealed a remarkable resilience. Out of war, debt, and division, the United States had begun to craft a national identity. It was not yet the powerful nation it would become, but it had survived its infancy, laying the foundation for the centuries ahead. The dawn of the 19th century brought with it a new chapter in the story of the United States. By 1800, the young republic had survived its infancy, endured partisan strife, and begun to find its place in the world. The election of 1800, often called the Revolution of 1800, marked a critical moment. Power peacefully shifted from one political faction to another, from the Federalists under John Adams to the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. It was the first time in modern history that such a transfer of authority occurred without violence or upheaval, and it demonstrated that the American experiment in self-government was not a fleeting accident, but a functioning reality. Jefferson's inauguration in March 1801 reflected his philosophy of simplicity. Unlike Washington and Adams, who often projected formality, Jefferson walked to the ceremony rather than arriving in a carriage, signaling a rejection of aristocratic airs. His words carried a message of unity. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. Jefferson believed that the survival of the Republic depended on reducing divisions and fostering a government close to the people. He favored limited federal power, cutting military expenditures, and shrinking the national debt. Yet, despite his vision of a small government, Jefferson's presidency would see the United States take bold steps that expanded both territory and authority in ways even he had not anticipated. One of the most transformative events of Jefferson's tenure came in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon Bonaparte, embroiled in wars across Europe and facing rebellion in the Caribbean, was willing to sell France's vast claim to the Louisiana Territory. For $15 million, the United States acquired land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, effectively doubling the size of the nation. Though Jefferson had long preached strict adherence to the Constitution, which made no explicit provision for purchasing territory, he embraced the opportunity. The Louisiana Purchase symbolized the nation's ambition and its future, an open continent filled with promise and potential. To explore this immense new acquisition, Jefferson commissioned the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their expedition, which began in 1804, trekked thousands of miles through uncharted lands, encountering vast plains, towering mountains, and winding rivers. They mapped routes, cataloged plants and animals, and established relations with numerous native tribes. The journals of Lewis and Clark revealed a continent both abundant and challenging. For Americans reading their reports, the West became not only a geographical space, but also a symbol of destiny, a frontier to be settled and transformed. Yet expansion brought conflict. Native American nations who had lived for centuries on the lands, now claimed by the United States, faced increasing pressure as settlers pushed westward. Some tribes sought accommodation while others resisted. The growing tension foreshadowed decades of displacement, warfare, and broken promises. The Louisiana Purchase promised opportunity for the Republic, but signaled the beginning of profound upheaval for indigenous peoples. While Jefferson celebrated expansion, foreign affairs troubled his administration. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe spilled across the Atlantic, drawing the United States into a precarious position between Britain and France. Both nations sought to block American trade with their enemy. British naval forces, in particular, angered Americans by seizing ships and impressing sailors, forcing them into service for the Royal Navy. Jefferson, determined to avoid war, attempted economic pressure instead of military conflict. The Embargo Act of 1807 prohibited American ships from trading with foreign ports. Jefferson hoped it would coerce Britain and France into respecting American neutrality. Instead, the embargo devastated American commerce, especially in New England, where ports lay idle and merchants suffered. The policy became deeply unpopular and highlighted the challenges of maintaining independence in a world dominated by European empires. As Jefferson stepped aside in 1809, he left the presidency to his close ally, James Madison. Madison inherited the same foreign troubles, and the tensions with Britain grew worse. By 1812, after years of maritime seizures and frontier conflicts, Congress declared war on Great Britain. The War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence, was a test of the nation's resilience. The war was controversial from the start. Federalists in New England opposed it, fearing damage to trade and doubting the nation's readiness for conflict. Indeed, the United States entered the war with a small army, limited resources, and internal division. Early campaigns against British Canada faltered. American attempts to invade across the northern border were met with defeat, while British forces, allied with Native American confederacies, pushed back strongly. On the frontier, one figure emerged as both an ally of Britain and a formidable leader in his own right: Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief. Tecumseh envisioned a united native confederacy to resist American expansion. His movement drew strength across the Midwest, and his alliance with the British gave them a powerful partner. The death of Tecumseh in battle in 1813 weakened the Confederacy, but his dream of resistance remained a lasting symbol of native struggle. Despite early setbacks, American fortunes improved as the war dragged on. Naval battles offered some of the first bright spots. On Lake Erie, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry secured a critical victory in 1813, famously declaring, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." These successes bolstered morale and allowed American forces to reclaim parts of the Northwest. Yet the most dramatic moment of the war came in 1814, when British troops marched on Washington, D.C. After defeating American forces at Bladensburg, they entered the capital, setting fire to public buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. Smoke and flames filled the sky, a humbling reminder of the young nation's vulnerability. But the humiliation was followed by resilience. In Baltimore, American defenders held firm at Fort McHenry, inspiring Francis Scott Key to pen the words that would later become the Star-Spangled Banner. In the South, General Andrew Jackson rose to prominence. At the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, Jackson's diverse army of regulars, militia, free black men, and even pirates inflicted a decisive defeat on the British. The victory came after a peace treaty had already been signed in Ghent, ending the war. But news traveled slowly across the Atlantic. Nevertheless, the triumph at New Orleans became a symbol of American pride and propelled Jackson to national fame. The Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war boundaries but resolved none of the issues of maritime rights that had sparked the conflict. Still, Americans celebrated the war as a vindication of independence. For many, it proved that the Republic could stand against one of the world's great powers. The era of good feelings that followed was marked by a sense of unity and national confidence, though the divisions of politics and society were never far from the surface. The early 19th century had transformed the United States. Jefferson's election had demonstrated the durability of Republican government. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the nation's size and expanded its horizons. The War of 1812 had tested and affirmed its resilience. Yet, alongside these achievements lay unresolved questions about the rights of native peoples, the morality of slavery, the balance between liberty and power. These issues would continue to shape the course of American history in the decades to come. The United States stood at the threshold of expansion and change. The frontier beckoned, industry began to stir, and new voices called for reform. The nation was no longer a fragile experiment. It was, instead, an emerging power, still defining itself, but increasingly confident in its destiny. The conclusion of the War of 1812 left the United States scarred, but strangely stronger. Though the treaty that ended the war restored things largely to the way they had been, the nation emerged with a new sense of unity and confidence. The victory at New Orleans, the resilience shown in the face of the burning of Washington, and the ability to stand against the British once again gave Americans a feeling of pride that transcended regional and political divisions. This period that followed is often remembered as the era of good feelings, a phrase used to describe the spirit of harmony and national purpose that seemed to characterize the decade after 1815. President James Monroe, elected in 1816, presided over much of this era. Monroe, a veteran of the Revolution and a respected statesman, symbolized continuity with the founding generation. His presidency was marked by widespread optimism. The Federalist Party, once a major force, had collapsed after its opposition to the War of 1812, leaving the Democratic Republicans dominant. For a time, partisan politics seemed muted. Without fierce party competition, the nation focused on development, expansion, and questions of identity. Yet beneath the surface of unity, old tensions remained, between North and South, between East and West, and between freedom and slavery. One of the most visible signs of American confidence during this period was the push for westward expansion. Settlers poured into new territories, moving beyond the Appalachian Mountains in greater numbers than ever before. The construction of new roads, such as the National Road, and the development of canals, most famously the Erie Canal completed in 1825, opened connections between the interior and the coastal states. The Erie Canal linked the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean via the Hudson River, dramatically reducing the cost of transporting goods and encouraging trade and migration. Towns and cities grew along its route, and New York City emerged as a major economic hub, foreshadowing its future dominance in finance and commerce. The growing infrastructure fueled what historians call the market revolution. Traditional, small-scale farming and local exchange gradually gave way to larger markets, cash crops, and industrial production. Textile mills in New England began to transform cotton into cloth on a large scale, linking the rural South, where cotton was grown by enslaved laborers, to the industrial North. This economic integration brought prosperity, but it also deepened the reliance on slavery in the South and created new inequalities in the urban North. Amid expansion and economic growth, the nation confronted the delicate balance of slavery in its politics. The addition of new states threatened to upset the equilibrium between free and slave states in Congress. The Missouri Crisis of 1820 forced the country to grapple with this issue directly. Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, sparking fears in the North of the expansion of slavery and concerns in the South about limits to their institution. The Missouri Compromise, engineered by Henry Clay, admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, preserving the balance in the Senate. It also prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the latitude 36 to 30 Eid line. While the compromise offered temporary peace, it underscored how divisive slavery had become and foreshadowed future conflict. During Monroe's presidency, American foreign policy also took a bold step. In 1823, Monroe, with significant input from his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, issued what came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. It declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization and that any attempt by European powers to interfere in the affairs of the Americas would be considered a hostile act against the United States. At the same time, it pledged that the U.S. would not interfere in European conflicts. Though the nation lacked the military power to enforce such a declaration, the Monroe Doctrine asserted a vision of American influence that would echo for generations. It revealed the growing confidence of the Republic and its ambition to shape the destiny of the hemisphere. The era of good feelings, however, was not without turmoil. Economic growth was often unstable, and in 1819 the nation experienced its first major financial crisis, the Panic of 1819. Caused by a collapse in agricultural prices and widespread speculation, the panic led to bank failures, unemployment, and hardship for many farmers and laborers. The crisis revealed the volatility of the new market economy and shook faith in the young nation's financial institutions. As Monroe's presidency drew to a close, new leaders began to emerge. Figures such as Henry Clay of Kentucky, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts represented different regions and interests, each with distinct visions for the nation's future. Clay championed his American system, which called for protective tariffs, a national bank, and federal investment in internal improvements. Calhoun defended states' rights and the South's slave-based economy. Webster became a powerful voice for Northern industry and national unity. These men would dominate American politics for decades, embodying the sectional divisions that threatened to pull the Union apart even as it grew. The election of 1824 revealed the cracks beneath the surface of unity. With multiple candidates vying for the presidency, no one received a majority of electoral votes. The contest went to the House of Representatives, where Henry Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams won, but Andrew Jackson, who had received the most popular and electoral votes, denounced the outcome as a corrupt bargain. The bitterness of this election shattered the illusion of nonpartisan politics. Factions coalesced into new political parties, setting the stage for the second-party system. Adams, though brilliant and visionary, struggled as president. His proposals for national improvements and scientific advancement met resistance from Congress. Meanwhile, Jackson, a war hero and populist figure, rallied supporters who believed Adams and the political elite had betrayed the people. The election of 1828 became one of the most contentious in American history, with personal attacks, fierce rhetoric, and unprecedented public engagement. Jackson's victory marked the rise of a new political era, one characterized by mass democracy, party organization, and the growing influence of popular will. Andrew Jackson's presidency symbolized a shift in American politics. He portrayed himself as the champion of the common man, standing against entrenched elites. Jackson expanded the reach of democracy by broadening suffrage to most white men, regardless of property ownership. His supporters formed the Democratic Party, while his opponents, united in their opposition, became the Whigs. Political life became more vibrant, more divisive, and more connected to the lives of ordinary citizens. Yet Jackson's vision of democracy was far from universal. For Native Americans, his presidency brought tragedy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced relocation of native tribes from their ancestral lands in the Southeast to territories west of the Mississippi. The policy culminated in the Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee and other tribes were driven from their homes, suffering immense loss and death along the journey. For enslaved African Americans, too, Jacksonian democracy meant little. The expansion of cotton cultivation and the growth of slavery in the Deep South entrenched a system of bondage even more deeply into the nation's fabric. Economically, Jackson's presidency was marked by battles over banking. He distrusted the Second Bank of the United States, viewing it as a tool of wealthy elites. His veto of the bank's recharter and subsequent withdrawal of federal deposits triggered fierce debate and ultimately contributed to financial instability. The Panic of 1837, which followed shortly after Jackson's departure, plunged the nation into another deep economic crisis. Despite its turmoil, the period of the 1820s and 1830s was transformative. The United States expanded territorially, politically, and socially. The Monroe Doctrine articulated a vision of hemispheric leadership. The Missouri Compromise revealed the fragile balance over slavery. The rise of Jacksonian democracy expanded political participation, but also sharpened sectional and racial divides. By the end of the 1830s, the United States was a nation in motion, growing, changing, and struggling to reconcile its ideals with its realities. It had doubled in size, declared its independence on the world stage, and embraced a new style of politics rooted in the people. But it also carried within it contradictions that would only grow sharper. Democracy for some, exclusion and oppression for others. The story of America was no longer one of mere survival. It was now a story of expansion, ambition, and conflict. By the 1840s, the United States was a nation gripped by a sense of destiny. The idea of manifest destiny, that Americans were divinely ordained to expand across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, had captured the imagination of politicians, settlers, and citizens alike. It was a belief that combined nationalism, economic ambition, and a sense of moral purpose, though its consequences were often violent and devastating. Expansion promised opportunity for farmers, merchants, and entrepreneurs, yet it also intensified the divisions over slavery, raised tensions with Native Americans, and led the country into war with Mexico. The election of 1844 brought James K. Polk to the presidency, a man deeply committed to territorial expansion. Polk, often called the Manifest Destiny President, set out an ambitious agenda: annex Texas, negotiate the Oregon boundary with Britain, and acquire California and New Mexico. Each of these goals was rooted in the belief that America had the right and duty to spread its institutions, yet they also carried the potential for conflict. Texas had declared independence from Mexico in 1836, establishing itself as the Republic of Texas. For nearly a decade, it remained a separate nation, seeking annexation by the United States. Many Americans, particularly Southerners, supported annexation, eager to expand cotton cultivation and, by extension, slavery. Others feared that annexing Texas would provoke war with Mexico, which still claimed the territory. Polk's commitment to expansion tipped the balance, and in 1845, Congress passed a resolution annexing Texas. Mexico responded angrily, severing diplomatic ties and setting the stage for conflict. The dispute quickly escalated into the Mexican-American War. The United States sent troops into the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, provoking skirmishes that Mexico viewed as invasions. The war was controversial at home. Critics, including Abraham Lincoln in his spot resolutions, questioned the legitimacy of the conflict, suggesting that Polk had provoked it for territorial gain. Nevertheless, the United States possessed superior resources and organization. American forces, led by generals such as Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, advanced into northern Mexico, capturing key cities and ultimately marching to Mexico City itself. The war was brutal and transformative. American soldiers faced disease, extreme heat, and difficult terrain. Cities were captured, battles fought in desert landscapes, and rivers crossed under enemy fire. Despite these hardships, victories came steadily. Taylor's troops won decisive battles at Palo Alto and Buena Vista, while Scott's amphibious landing at Veracruz opened the road to the Mexican capital. By September 1847, Scott's army occupied Mexico City. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 formalized the U.S. acquisition of vast territories, including California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and New Mexico. In return, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and assumed certain claims by American citizens. The Mexican-American War expanded the United States geographically, but it also intensified the slavery debate. Would these new territories allow slavery, or would they remain free? The question split the nation along sectional lines. Southerners wanted to extend slavery to the new lands, while many Northerners opposed its expansion. The debate shaped the Compromise of 1850, engineered again by Henry Clay. California was admitted as a free state, while New Mexico and Utah were allowed to decide through popular sovereignty. The Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, requiring citizens to assist in the capture of runaway enslaved people, a law that inflamed Northern opposition and sowed the seeds of deeper sectional tension. At the same time, westward expansion brought settlers into conflict with Native Americans on a massive scale. Trails such as the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail carried thousands of immigrants into territories previously controlled by tribes who had lived there for generations. The movement of settlers displaced Native communities, leading to violent confrontations and forced removals. Policies designed to relocate Native populations, often justified by a combination of security, settlement, and ideology, continued the tragic pattern established decades earlier under Jackson and during the Indian removal period. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 transformed the West yet again. The gold rush drew hundreds of thousands of people from across the United States and around the world. San Francisco grew from a small settlement into a bustling city seemingly overnight. Miners, merchants, and entrepreneurs poured into the territory, reshaping the economy, society, and environment. But this influx also exacerbated conflicts with Native Americans, displaced Mexicans who had lived in the region, and created lawlessness in many mining towns. Meanwhile, the political landscape grew more contentious. The 1850s were marked by the rise of sectional parties and the fracturing of traditional alliances. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas, allowed settlers in those territories to determine whether they would allow slavery through popular sovereignty. The act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise line and triggered violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed in the territory. The violence shocked the nation, signaling that compromise over slavery was becoming increasingly impossible. The political crisis fueled the emergence of new parties. The Republican Party was founded in the mid-1850s as a coalition opposed to the expansion of slavery. Leaders like Abraham Lincoln and William Seward voiced moral and political opposition to the spread of slavery into new territories, framing it as incompatible with Republican principles. The sectional divisions became increasingly entrenched, with northern states moving toward anti-slavery positions and southern states defending their peculiar institution with increasing fervor. Technological and economic changes accompanied these social and political upheavals. Railroads expanded across the Midwest and Northeast, linking cities and opening markets. Telegraph lines improved communication across long distances. Industry continued to grow in northern cities, while southern agriculture became increasingly dependent on cotton and enslaved labor. These developments reinforced the economic differences between regions. deepening the divisions that would soon test the survival of the Union. By the late 1850s, the United States was a nation on the brink. It had grown from 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast into a continental power stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It had fought wars, acquired territories, expanded commerce, and built infrastructure. Yet, it remained deeply divided. Slavery, once a tolerated institution, had become the central moral, political, and social question. Native Americans had been systematically displaced. Immigrants were arriving in large numbers, adding new tensions and cultural complexity. And the promises of manifest destiny, once a source of optimism, now seemed inseparable from conflict and injustice. The stage was set for a conflict that would eclipse all previous struggles. The debates over freedom, expansion, and the nature of the Union could no longer be contained within Congress or treaties. They would erupt across the nation in a struggle that would test every ideal for which Americans had fought since 1776. The United States, so young and so vast, faced the coming storm of civil war, a test not of territory, but of the very principles upon which the Republic had been founded. By the 1850s, the United States had grown immensely in size, population, and economic complexity, but its unity was fraying. The expansion of territory following the Mexican-American War, coupled with rapid industrialization in the North and the deepening reliance on slave labor in the South, had created a nation increasingly divided along sectional lines. The compromises that had once held the country together now seemed fragile at best. The debate over slavery, which had simmered for decades, became the central and defining issue of American politics, social life, and identity, setting the stage for a conflict that would soon engulf the entire nation. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily staved off sectional conflict by balancing the admission of California as a free state with the passage of a stricter Fugitive Slave Act, among other measures. However, the Fugitive Slave Act proved deeply controversial in the North. Northern citizens, outraged by laws that required them to aid in the capture of escaped enslaved people, began organizing abolitionist networks and resistances. Figures like Harriet Tubman and others in the Underground Railroad became central to the effort to assist fugitive slaves, moving them northward toward freedom in Canada. This heightened moral and political tensions as southern states demanded stricter enforcement, while northern states increasingly resisted compliance. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 further inflamed the situation. By allowing settlers in Kansas and Nebraska territories to determine the legality of slavery through popular sovereignty, it effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise line of 1820. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri flooded into Kansas, hoping to sway the vote, while anti-slavery settlers from the north arrived to counter them. The result was a period of violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, with rival militias burning homes, raiding settlements, and engaging in pitched battles. John Brown, a radical abolitionist, became infamous during this period for leading armed attacks on pro-slavery settlers, believing that violent action was necessary to confront the moral atrocity of slavery. The violence in Kansas demonstrated that compromise alone could no longer contain the sectional tensions that had been building for decades. Meanwhile, the nation's legal system became a battleground over the question of slavery. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, delivered by the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be considered citizens and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. Moreover, the decision declared the federal government had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The ruling outraged Northern abolitionists and strengthened Southern resolve to defend and expand the institution of slavery. It deepened the sense that the federal government was biased toward Southern interests, exacerbating sectional animosity and undermining the legitimacy of national compromise. Amid these rising tensions, political realignments were underway. The Whig Party, unable to reconcile internal divisions over slavery, collapsed. The Republican Party, founded in the mid-1850s, emerged as the dominant anti-slavery party in the North. Abraham Lincoln, though initially a relatively obscure lawyer and politician in Illinois, became a prominent voice in the debate over the expansion of slavery. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and politically corrosive, but he initially focused on preventing its spread into the Western territories, rather than advocating immediate abolition where it already existed. His eloquence and logical arguments made him a rising star within the Republican Party, and a figure capable of challenging Southern pro-slavery dominance. The election of 1860 brought these sectional tensions to a head. The Democratic Party, deeply divided over slavery, split into Northern and Southern factions. Abraham Lincoln, running on the Republican ticket, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, reflecting the deep sectional divide. Southern leaders saw Lincoln's election as a direct threat to the institution of slavery and to their social and economic order. Within months, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860, declaring that the federal government no longer represented their rights or interests. Other Southern states soon followed, forming the Confederate States of America in early 1861, with Jefferson Davis elected as its president. The Confederacy articulated its commitment to protecting slavery as a central principle, making clear that the conflict was fundamentally about the preservation of the Southern way of life and the institution of bondage upon which it relied. The division was now complete, and the fragile bonds that had held the nation together for nearly a century were broken. Tensions escalated quickly. Federal forts in the South, including Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, became flashpoints. Lincoln, committed to preserving the Union, faced the challenge of responding to secession without immediately provoking war. Yet he understood that allowing the Confederacy to seize federal property unopposed would undermine the authority of the United States. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, forcing its surrender. This marked the official beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, prompting additional Southern states to secede and join the Confederacy. The war that followed would test every aspect of the United States, its military, political institutions, economy, and social fabric. The Union faced the daunting task of bringing back the seceded states while grappling with the profound moral question of slavery. The Confederacy, fighting for independence and the preservation of slavery, sought to defend its territory and way of life against overwhelming odds. Families were divided, communities split, and the nation descended into a conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The coming struggle would involve vast armies, innovative military strategies, and battles that scarred the landscape and memory of the nation. From Bull Run to Antietam, from Shiloh to Gettysburg, the Civil War unfolded as a massive, grinding confrontation of ideology, economy, and human endurance. Slavery, the central cause of secession, became an inescapable moral issue, compelling leaders like Lincoln to act not only as politicians, but as moral arbiters in a war that would determine the fate of millions of people. The outbreak of war also brought profound economic and social consequences. In the North, industry and infrastructure became central to the war effort. Factories produced arms, ammunition, and supplies, while railroads and telegraphs enabled rapid movement and communication. In the South, the plantation economy struggled under blockade, shortages, and the disruption of trade. Enslaved people, sensing the instability of the war, seized opportunities to escape, resist, and, in some cases, join Union forces to fight for their freedom. As 1861 unfolded, the United States entered a period of unprecedented national crisis. The ideals of the Revolution, which had promised liberty and self-government, now faced their greatest test. Would the Union survive? Could the nation reconcile the moral, political, and economic contradictions that had festered for decades? The Civil War was not simply a conflict over borders or military strategy. It was a profound struggle over the very meaning of the American experiment. In these early months of the war, the nation was both fragile and resilient. Leaders on both sides understood the stakes were monumental, though their visions of the country's future were irreconcilable. Families prepared to send sons to fight, communities braced for destruction, and the country, still young in its national consciousness, confronted the reality that the choices made now would echo through generations. The war would be long, bloody, and transformative, testing not only armies, but the ideals of liberty, equality, and union upon which the United States had been founded. The Civil War, which began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April 1861, quickly became the defining conflict in the history of the United States. What had started as a confrontation over secession and the authority of the federal government evolved into a profound struggle over the future of the nation and the fate of millions of enslaved people. Both the Union and the Confederacy mobilized enormous resources, and the scale of the conflict transformed every aspect of American life. From the outset, the Union faced immense challenges. Though it had a larger population, more factories, and an extensive railroad network, these advantages did not immediately translate into military success. The Confederacy, fighting primarily on its own territory, leveraged familiarity with the landscape, strong military leadership, and a deep commitment to defending its homes and way of life. Figures such as Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and J.E.B. Stuart became legendary for their skill and daring, creating formidable obstacles for Union forces. The first major engagement, the First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, in July 1861, shattered the illusions of a quick war. Northern troops, inexperienced and poorly coordinated, were routed by Confederate forces, forcing a chaotic retreat back to Washington. D.C. civilians who had come to watch the battle in curiosity witnessed the brutality and chaos firsthand, marking the beginning of the realization that the conflict would be long and deadly. Union leadership struggled to find effective generals during the early years of the war. The political and military establishment debated strategy, faced logistical challenges, and wrestled with morale issues. Ulysses S. Grant, who would later become the commander of all Union armies, initially gained recognition with victories in the Western theater, including the capture of Forts Henry and Donelson in 1862. Grant's approach emphasized relentless pressure on Confederate forces, exploiting the North's superior resources and industrial capacity. In the East, Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862, demonstrating both tactical brilliance and strategic daring. His campaigns in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, culminating in the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, brought tremendous casualties. Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, ended Lee's invasion of the North and provided Abraham Lincoln with the political opportunity to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order, effective January 1, 1863, declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be free. While it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals, it fundamentally altered the character of the war, linking the Union cause with the moral imperative of ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation also had strategic implications. It discouraged European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing or supporting the Confederacy, as public opinion in Europe largely opposed slavery. Additionally, it allowed African Americans to join the Union Army and Navy, contributing tens of thousands of troops who provided labor, intelligence, and combat support, reshaping the composition and character of Union forces. Meanwhile, the war's brutality intensified. Battles such as Gettysburg in July 1863, Vicksburg in Mississippi, and Chickamauga in Georgia exemplified the scale of the conflict. Gettysburg, often regarded as the turning point in the Eastern Theater, saw Lee's army repelled after 3 days of intense combat, resulting in staggering casualties on both sides. At the same time, Grant's siege of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy and demonstrating the growing strategic effectiveness of Union operations. The home front experienced tremendous strain. Northern and Southern civilians alike endured shortages, inflation, and the constant anxiety of loved ones at war. In the South, the Union blockade and the devastation of farmland and infrastructure created food scarcity and economic hardship. In the North, industrial production ramped up to supply armies, yet workers faced strikes and labor disputes. Women assumed new roles, managing farms, businesses, and households in the absence of men, while also serving as nurses, organizers, and volunteers. Figures such as Clara Barton emerged, providing care to soldiers on both sides and laying the groundwork for future humanitarian efforts. As the war progressed, Lincoln's leadership became increasingly critical. He balanced the demands of military strategy, political opposition, and public opinion while pursuing the goal of preserving the Union. The president faced criticism from all sides. Radical Republicans pressed for immediate and uncompensated abolition. Democrats accused him of overreach, and generals struggled under immense pressure. Lincoln's capacity for patience, judgment, and moral clarity gradually shaped the Union war effort into a coherent strategy aimed not only at defeating Confederate armies, but also at transforming the social and political landscape of the nation. In 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies, consolidating military command and emphasizing coordinated offensives across multiple theaters. Grant's approach, combined with William Tecumseh Sherman's campaigns in Georgia and the Carolinas, brought the Confederacy to the brink of collapse. Sherman's march to the sea exemplified a new kind of warfare, targeting infrastructure, supplies, and morale to weaken the South's capacity to continue fighting. The destruction of railroads, crops, and cities demonstrated the totalizing nature of modern war and foreshadowed the profound social and economic upheaval that would follow. Meanwhile, the political stakes remained high. Lincoln faced re-election in 1864 amidst uncertainty about the war's outcome. His victory reaffirmed Northern commitment to the Union cause and provided the political mandate to continue the struggle until final victory and the permanent abolition of slavery. By April 1865, Confederate forces, exhausted and demoralized, surrendered. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, symbolically and practically marked the end of the Confederacy, though pockets of resistance persisted briefly. The aftermath of the war left the United States transformed. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment, fundamentally altering the nation's social and legal structure. Millions of formerly enslaved people sought to claim freedom, land, and political rights, even as systemic challenges and resistance persisted. The Southern economy was devastated. Cities lay in ruins, and the social hierarchy that had underpinned slavery was shattered. The North, while victorious, bore the cost of over 360,000 lives lost and widespread economic strain. The war had proven that the survival of the Union required both military might and moral purpose, intertwining questions of governance, liberty, and justice in ways that would define the nation for generations. The Civil War also created a legacy of federal power. The wartime centralization of authority, including the ability to raise armies, levy taxes, regulate commerce, and issue currency, expanded the reach of the national government. Lincoln's use of executive authority, particularly in suspension of habeas corpus and the issuance of wartime orders, set precedents that would influence presidential power long after the war ended. The nation emerged stronger institutionally, but with deep wounds and lingering social divisions. In conclusion, the Civil War was not only a military struggle, but a moral and political crucible. It tested the principles of the Republic, the limits of federal authority, and the nation's capacity to confront injustice. The sacrifices of soldiers and civilians alike reshaped American identity, redefining the meaning of freedom and citizenship. The preservation of the Union and the abolition of slavery marked monumental achievements. Yet the country faced the immense challenge of Reconstruction, reconciliation, and rebuilding a society fractured by decades of conflict. The surrender of Confederate forces in 1865 marked the end of the Civil War, but it did not mark the end of struggle. The nation faced an even greater challenge: Reconstruction. The Union had been preserved and slavery abolished, but millions of formerly enslaved people, devastated Southern economies, and a politically fractured country demanded a careful yet transformative effort to rebuild. The period from 1865 to 1877 tested the very foundations of American democracy. As leaders attempted to integrate formerly enslaved populations into society, rebuild Southern states, and reconcile North and South. President Abraham Lincoln had envisioned a lenient Reconstruction, aiming to reunite the country quickly. His assassination in April 1865, however, placed Vice President Andrew Johnson in power. Johnson, a Southern Democrat loyal to the Union, held views deeply sympathetic to former Confederate interests and was resistant to policies aimed at empowering formerly enslaved people. His approach clashed sharply with the radical Republicans in Congress, who sought to fundamentally transform Southern society. The resulting conflict between the President and Congress defined early Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, became a key instrument in assisting formerly enslaved people. It provided food, housing, education, and legal support to freedmen and poor whites across the South. Schools were established for African Americans, and Northern missionaries and teachers, often called carpetbaggers by Southerners, played a critical role in promoting literacy and civic engagement. For the first time, formerly enslaved individuals had access to formal education, enabling future generations to participate more fully in political and economic life. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 imposed military governance over Southern states, requiring them to draft new constitutions guaranteeing African American men the right to vote. These measures were revolutionary. For the first time in American history, African Americans could participate in government, vote, and hold office. Figures such as Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were elected to the U.S. Senate, symbolizing a remarkable, albeit fragile, political transformation. African Americans held seats in state legislatures, helped establish public schools, and exercised newfound civic authority. Despite these gains, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance. White supremacist organizations, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, emerged to intimidate African Americans and their allies through violence and terror. Sharecropping, a system in which freed people worked land owned by whites in exchange for a share of the crop, became widespread. While it offered a semblance of independence, it often trapped families in cycles of debt and dependency, limiting economic mobility. Southern states enacted black codes, laws designed to restrict African Americans' rights, control labor, and maintain the social hierarchy of slavery. The political struggle intensified during President Ulysses S. Grant's administration, 1869-1877. Grant, a former Union general, supported Reconstruction policies and used federal power to suppress violent resistance in the South, including actions against the Ku Klux Klan. The Enforcement Acts allowed the federal government to intervene when states failed to protect African American citizens' rights, marking a significant expansion of national authority in defense of civil liberties. However, as economic difficulties and political fatigue grew in the North, support for Reconstruction waned. Corruption scandals in Grant's administration, coupled with the Panic of 1873, weakened public enthusiasm for intervention in the South. By 1877, Reconstruction came to an end with the Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. In exchange for conceding the presidency to Hayes, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, effectively ending federal enforcement of Reconstruction policies. Southern states swiftly enacted laws to disenfranchise African Americans, imposed segregation, and maintained economic systems that limited upward mobility. The brief era of political and social experimentation for African Americans ended, giving way to Jim Crow, a system of racial oppression that would persist well into the 20th century. Meanwhile, the nation as a whole faced other challenges. The westward expansion that had fueled the mid-19th century continued. Railroads stretched across the continent, linking the coasts, enabling mass migration, and opening territories for settlement. Native Americans suffered devastating displacement, wars, and forced assimilation under policies like the Indian Appropriations Act of 1851 and later, the Dawes Act. The frontier economy grew rapidly, with mining, agriculture, and ranching fueling new markets and regional development. Towns sprouted, cities expanded, and the population surged. Yet these developments came at the expense of indigenous populations and the environment. The industrialization of the United States accelerated during and after Reconstruction. Factories, mills, and railroads transformed the economy, particularly in the North and Midwest. Immigrant labor fueled urban growth, and new technologies such as the telegraph, steam power, and mechanized manufacturing reshaped daily life and commerce. The rise of corporate entities and the expansion of markets created wealth and opportunity, but also labor unrest and inequality. Workers began organizing, demanding better conditions, wages, and hours, setting the stage for future labor movements. Socially and culturally, the United States evolved. Freed African Americans built communities, churches, schools, and civic organizations that would sustain them through the harsh realities of post-Reconstruction life. Literature, journalism, and public discourse increasingly grappled with the legacies of slavery, war, and emancipation. Public memory of the Civil War became contested. Northern and Southern narratives diverged, often emphasizing heroism, sacrifice, and sectional pride rather than the moral and political issues at the heart of the conflict. By the end of Reconstruction, the United States had emerged as a transformed nation. Slavery had been abolished, the Union preserved, and the Constitution amended to guarantee citizenship and voting rights. Yet the promise of equality remained unfulfilled, and the tensions of race, regionalism, and economic inequality persisted. The war and its aftermath had fundamentally reshaped political authority, national identity, and the balance between state and federal power, leaving a legacy that would reverberate for generations. The story of the United States up to this point is one of growth, struggle, and resilience. From the founding of 13 colonies to the crucible of civil war and the contentious Reconstruction era, the nation had endured profound challenges. It expanded territorially from coast to coast, navigated wars with foreign powers, confronted the moral and political contradictions of slavery, and wrestled with the meaning of liberty and citizenship. Every stage of this history reflected a delicate balance between ideals and realities, between opportunity and injustice, and between unity and division. The United States that emerged from Reconstruction in 1877 was neither perfect nor fully healed. It was a nation profoundly changed, more industrial, more connected, and yet socially fractured. Its institutions had been tested. Its citizens had endured hardship and loss. Yet the story of survival, adaptation, and aspiration continued. Americans had faced enormous challenges and emerged with a stronger sense of national identity, even as they confronted the enduring legacies of inequality and injustice. The journey from a fledgling republic to a continental power, from a society divided by slavery to one attempting to redefine freedom, set the stage for the next chapter. The growth of industrial America, the continued expansion westward, and the ongoing struggle to reconcile ideals with reality. In the end, the history of the United States up to 1877 is a story of paradox, liberty and oppression, unity and division, expansion and displacement, growth and suffering. It is a history that is at once inspiring and sobering, demonstrating both the possibilities of human endeavor and the costs of human failure. The nation had survived revolution, expansion, and civil war, and though the work of building a just and equitable society remained unfinished, the foundation had been laid. The story of the United States, in its complexity, its triumphs, and its tragedies, continued onward, a testament to the resilience and ambition of its people.